All right, buckle up, everybody. We're diving into Mexico today. And let me tell you, listener, this isn't just about beaches and resorts. We're going deep. We've got a stack of articles, data, the works, all prepped to unpack what makes Mexico such a fascinating and complex place.
And it is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, Mexico really is a country of contrasts.
No kidding. I mean, just off the bat, we're talking the sixth most visited country globally. People are drawn to Mexico for a reason, right? But then you start digging a little and you see the headlines. Crime, corruption, you name it. It's like, how do these two realities coexist?
That's the thing about Mexico. It defies easy categorization. It's a place that grabs you, pulls you in, and the more you learn, the more you realize how much more there is to discover, which is, I think, why we do these deep dives, right? To get past those surface level impressions.
Exactly. And speaking of getting past the surface, did you know Mexico has more Spanish speakers than any other country on Earth?
That's a cultural impact that echoes through history, wouldn't you say? Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Spanish is just one layer of the cultural tapestry. We're talking about a region that was home to incredible civilizations long before European arrival.
Oh, yeah, and not just the Aztecs, which is who usually come to mind first.
Right. Think Teotihuacan, for example. This was a massive city, I mean truly massive, with pyramids to rival those in Egypt. And it flourished centuries before the Aztecs, which just goes to show the depth of history in this region.
Wow. Okay, I'm picturing it now, a sprawling metropolis right here in the Americas over 1,000 years ago. That's mind-blowing. But eventually, the Spanish conquistadors do arrive, and that's when things get, well, complicated, to say the least.
To put it mildly.
The text really highlighted silver as a driving force behind the conquest. But it wasn't just about land, was it?
No, silver became this obsession for the Spanish. It shaped their entire approach to colonization. We're talking about extracting vast wealth, and that set the stage for centuries of power struggles over resources.
It's like that power dynamic, that control over resources, it ripples through history and still affects Mexico today. We can't forget, we're talking about 300 years of New Spain, right? With the church and the state hand in hand. That's a lot of influence to unravel.
There's no doubt about that. And it's a mixed legacy. On one hand, you have the stunning architecture, the art, this beautiful blending of indigenous traditions and Spanish influences. But we have to remember, this often came at a cost. The suppression of indigenous cultures, forced assimilation, not to mention the exploitation of resources and people. That tension, that push and pull between progress and exploitation, it's a recurring theme in Mexican history.
It's like a thread woven through the entire narrative, right?
Exactly.
And it's not like that tension magically disappeared with independence in the 1800s. In fact, it sounds like declaring independence was the easy part. Then comes the hard work. Building a nation, figuring out identity, and facing down a whole lot of internal conflict. You even got to the point where Mexico had a French-installed emperor for a while there. Can you imagine?
It's a period that's often overlooked, but it's crucial for understanding modern Mexico. Imagine the challenge. You've thrown off centuries of colonial rule. Now what? How do you build a stable government, a unified nation, when you're starting from scratch?
And they had foreign powers meddling in their affairs, trying to take advantage of the situation. Talk about a tough start. It really makes you appreciate how fragile stability can be.
It does. And it makes the achievements of leaders like Benito Juarez all the more impressive. He emerges from this chaotic period as a symbol of Mexican resilience and self-determination.
He's not your typical national hero, is he? The articles pointed out that he was a lawyer, not a military man, and from an indigenous Zapotec community. To rise to the presidency during such a turbulent time, that speaks volumes about his character.
It does, and in many ways, Juarez embodies that blend of indigenous heritage and modern ideals that continues to define Mexico. He faced down internal divisions, stood up to foreign intervention, and laid the groundwork for a modern, independent nation.
Juarez left a heck of a legacy, that's for sure. But then we get to the Porfiriato, and man, it feels like that classic Mexican story, right? Progress, but at what cost?
Yeah, it's a bit of a roller coaster, this period. Porfirio Diaz, he was actually a hero from the earlier fight against the French, but he takes power and, well, he doesn't let go for a long time. Decades, we're talking. And on the surface, it looks like a golden age, right? Economic boom, railroads everywhere, foreign investments pouring in.
But I'm sensing there's a however coming. There's got to be another side to this story.
There always is. Diaz, he might have brought stability, but let me tell you, it came at a cost. We're talking about a ruler who did not tolerate opposition, not one bit. And yes, some folks got rich, but for the majority of Mexicans, especially indigenous communities, let's just say they weren't exactly reaping the benefits of this so-called progress.
So not exactly a recipe for, social harmony then.
You could say that again. And, well, that unrest, it didn't stay simmering for long. Cue the Mexican Revolution. And this wasn't just a change in leadership. Oh, no, this was a seismic shift, a total reshaping of Mexican society.
Yeah, the sources really drove that point home.
Yeah.
It's like multiple revolutions happening all at once, different factions, different goals, all fighting for their vision of Mexico. You've got larger-than-life figures like Pancho Villa in the north, Emiliano Zapata fighting for land reform in the south. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is, and that's what makes it so compelling. It's a period of intense violence, absolutely, but also this incredible wellspring of idealism. These revolutionaries, they were fighting for the everyday Mexican, for social justice, for a chance to finally make those promises of independence a reality.
And of course, you can't talk about the Mexican Revolution without mentioning the U.S., right? And as we know, when the U.S. gets involved, things usually get messier.
Understatement of the century. The U.S. and Mexico, it's always been a complicated relationship, and this period is a prime example. They played favorites, backing certain factions, even sending troops across the border.
Adding fuel to the fire, as usual.
Pretty much. But here's the thing. Even amidst all this chaos, this upheaval, something really remarkable happens. The birth of a new constitution.
And get this, listener. It's still the governing document of Mexico today. That's incredible staying power.
It really is. The Constitution of 1917, it's an incredible document. It took those revolutionary ideals, land reform, workers' rights, limits on foreign ownership, and made them law. It was a bold statement, a commitment to building a more just and independent nation.
But I'm guessing putting those ideals into practice, well, that's the real challenge, isn't it?
You've hit the nail on the head. The revolution may have ended, but the fight to create a truly just and equitable society, well, that was just beginning. And to be honest, that struggle continues to this day.
And so begins the era of the PRI.
Right.
One party ruling for most of the 20th century. That's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it.
71 years, to be exact.
Yeah.
And the PRI's rise to power, it's directly tied to that legacy of the revolution. On the one hand, they brought stability, no doubt about that. They oversaw periods of real economic growth and put Mexico on the map as a leader in Latin America.
But there's always a but, right?
Right. Again, the PRI's grip on power, let's just say it wasn't always, how should we put it, by the book. There was corruption, definitely a silencing of dissenting voices, and this tendency to prioritize stability, even at the cost of individual liberties.
The classic dilemma of progress, right?
Yeah.
Who benefits and at what cost?
Exactly. And just when you think it can't get any more complicated, boom, NAFTA enters the chat.
NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Textbook example of globalization in action, all those intended and maybe not so intended consequences. The sources painted a picture of, well, a mixed bag, to put it lightly. Economic growth, sure, but also social unrest bubbling up, especially in indigenous communities.
Yeah, you can't talk about NAFTA without talking about the Zapatista uprising. That happened right as NAFTA was being implemented, and it was a direct response to, well, all those anxieties about globalization, exploitation of workers, environmental damage, this sense that people, especially indigenous communities, were being left out of the conversation.
So we're back to that same tension, aren't we?
Oh.
Progress, but who's it really benefiting? Mexico trying to find its place in the global economy, but wrestling with the social and cultural implications. It's like this push and pull between moving forward and dealing with the past. It never really ends, does it?
It's part of what makes Mexico so dynamic. It's a country that's constantly evolving, always grappling with its identity, and that makes for a pretty exciting story.
And speaking of exciting, how about that moment in 2000 when the PRI finally, after 71 years, loses its grip on power? That's got to be a landmark event, right?
Talk about a political earthquake. I mean, after 7 decades of one-party rule, can you imagine the expectations, the hopes, the anxieties? It was a huge moment for Mexican democracy, a sign that real change was actually possible.
But even with a more democratic system, it's not like those deep-rooted issues just vanish overnight, do they?
Yeah.
The crime, the corruption, the inequality, those are tough nuts to crack.
You're telling me they're all tangled up together, these issues. Like, take the drug war, for example. It's easy to simplify it, to see it as just good guys versus bad guys, but the reality is way more complex.
Oh, yeah.
That violence, that lawlessness, it's fueled by poverty, lack of opportunity, and these incredibly powerful cartels. It's a symptom of those deeper societal issues we've been talking about all along.
It's like a snake eating its own tail.
Yeah.
Where do you even begin to untangle something like that?
It's a massive challenge, and there's no easy fix. But even with all the difficulties, there's this incredible spirit in Mexico, this resilience that shines through. It's pretty inspiring, actually.
It really is.
Yeah.
And you can't talk about Mexico without talking about its culture, right? I mean, it's such a vibrant mix. Indigenous traditions, Spanish colonial influences, and now globalization adding its own flavor to the mix.
It's a cultural kaleidoscope, and that blend, it's everywhere you look, from the food to the music to the art. Speaking of which, did you know that Mexico is considered one of the most biodiverse countries in the world?
No kidding.
Yeah, and that biodiversity, it's not just a statistic, it's woven into the fabric of everyday life, and especially the cuisine, which, by the way, has been recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity.
It's a
big deal.
Well-deserved, if you ask me.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's about way more than just tacos, as much as I love a good taco. Though, I have to admit, this whole deep dive is making me crave some authentic Mexican food, that's for sure.
I hear you.
But it's not just the food, right? It's the art, the architecture, this incredible creative energy that just seems to pulsate through the country.
Absolutely. Think Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, these iconic Mexican artists. They weren't shying away from the big questions. They tackled identity, social justice, the whole complicated history of their country, and they did it with such passion and creativity. And that tradition, it's still going strong today. Mexican artists, they're not afraid to challenge the status quo, to push boundaries.
It's like Mexico itself, always evolving, always reinventing, but never forgetting where it came from.
That's a great way to put it, and that's what makes it so endlessly fascinating.
Well said. Wow, what a journey this has been. We've explored the ancient cities and the colonial era, the revolutions and the struggles for democracy, the cultural richness, and the challenges that never seem to end.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did, but honestly, it feels like we just scratched the surface. Which is kind of the point, right?
Always. That's the beauty of a good deep dive. It opens more doors than it closes.
Exactly. So to our listener out there, we leave you with this. What surprised you most about Mexico today? What resonated with you, sparked your curiosity? Take that curiosity, do some digging, and see where it leads you. Because trust me, when it comes to Mexico, there's always something more to uncover, always another layer to explore. Until next time, keep exploring.